Hello, everyone. It's Jeff Rich here from the Burning Archive, and welcome to my live stream. Ukraine Endgame, deal or no deal? Conflict, confusion, or continuity. I'm not quite sure how I titled the live stream. And I have, I'll bring myself onto screen. I have a very special guest with me today to talk about where we are at with the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, and that is Warwick Powell. Welcome back to the show, Warwick.
How are you, Jeff? Great to be back with you.
Well, it's great to be back with you. I was just saying before we started that I was looking back this morning on a discussion we had in February. I think it was even before the Riyadh meeting, talking about what prospects for peace might be. And I think one of the things you said then was this is going to be a slow process, and it's not really running to the timetables of media, social media or electoral cycles. That there are some deeper sort of issues involved, and I guess I'm really keen to explore some of those, deeper diplomatic issues, almost how both US and Russia are learning how to act diplomatically towards each other again, and maybe even Europe too, during this discussion. But perhaps we can start with your, top line assessment of where we're at after the Alaska summit and the meeting of European and Ukrainian leaders with President Trump in the White House yesterday.
Well, look, it's funny that you talk about the discussion that we had in February, because my starting point actually after the Anchorage summit was to go back into the archives and look at a piece that I wrote in February, which was after the first phone call between President Trump and President Putin, and I think it did hold up reasonably well. The sad thing about it holding up well, of course, is that the war continues, because had that piece and those thought processes not held up well, we might have already entered into a cessation of hostilities and peace. Look, I think that this is an inflection moment, but it's one that is racked by confusion and lack of clarity of direction. It's an inflection moment in part because it is a recognition that the material dynamics on the battlefield are becoming increasingly undeniable in Russia's favor, and that the Western coalition is compelled to respond. For a number of years, as the battle has unfolded, there has been a tendency to either fully deny that Russia was prevailing to a point where, in fact, all sorts of so-called evidence would be fabricated to imply that Russia, in fact, was on the verge of a catastrophic defeat on the battlefield, on the one hand, all the way through to the view that, well, if Russia is prevailing, it's simply because the West isn't committing enough effort to supporting the Ukrainians to fight Russia. And so the status quo on the battlefield is really just a consequence of an absence of sufficient political will on the part of the West. And then a variation on that theme has been the idea that, well, maybe the Russians can't be defeated, but we've sort of stalemated the war, and we need to continue arming Ukraine to somehow improve Ukraine's negotiating position from what the status quo is. Now, that's actually a nonsensical view, because it's logically incoherent. If supplying more arms to Ukraine could transform Ukraine's negotiating position from where it sits today, then why would you stop? You would continue, not just to improve a negotiating position, but to ultimately prevail in the war. So that last view really is clutching at straws, in my view. So I think the reality on the ground is compelling those sort of cornerstone narratives to um, confront things that have been unpalatable to date. Because of that, we've had the summit in Anchorage. Put it the other way, Jeff, without there being a compelling deterioration of the Ukrainian position on the battlefield, I doubt that there would have been the summit at all. So that's the first dimension of this inflection point. The second dimension.
And Warwick, sorry to interrupt, but I'd also probably add, without Donald Trump's sort of defeat in the economic war that he's been launching since April, it probably wouldn't have happened either as well.
Yeah, look, so there's other
Yeah.
context broadly around the presidency. So we're 7 months into the presidency. It came in with an incredible amount of energetic promise across many big dimensions. You know, the war in Ukraine, the economic dimensions in terms of reshaping America's interactions with the rest of the world. And of course, he's also experienced some domestic pressure around what are really touchstone issues for aspects of his electoral base. And I'm talking about the Epstein files, for example, and how that's been handled. So there has been, I think, a shift in the political dynamics domestically, where the authority that the new president typically has when they assume office after inauguration has rapidly evaporated. You know, the honeymoon period has been short-lived, and the authority that of the bully pulpit has diminished substantially, to a point where I think he is also confronting domestic opposition, not only from those on the opposite side of the political fence, but also from forces inside the Republican Party that have been quite at odds with his broader agenda in relation to the Ukraine question. So we've confronted that first reality. The second part of this inflection moment is that he was able to, in effect, call together the other members of the grand coalition of this war against Russia in Ukraine. And within 3 days, of course, they were assembled in the White House. We've had mountains of commentary about this, looking at body language, close-up photos of facial expressions, and all of the usual sort of commentary that comes with the day-to-day analytics of these sorts of events, which, either talks about European vassalage on the one hand and collapse and humiliation, or it talks about, Trump's failure to stand up to Putin, and this represents a catastrophic collapse of America, etc., etc. So there's been these sorts of typical running commentary, sporting event style of analyses. I tend to think that all of that notwithstanding, the reason why this inflection point is an important one to get our heads around is that it speaks to a fraying of the rationale that held this coalition together in the face of realities on the battlefield, on the one hand, but the obvious problems in reframing this coalition around a different set of roles, and Trump's attempts to translate these new circumstances through the coalition and turn that coalition and its efforts towards a slightly different end. This is important to understand because it actually, I think, forces us to think a little bit more deeply about the question of European subordination and the way that power works. So a subordinate and a vassal, dependent on the beneficence of their lord, would largely be in a position where they were compelled to act as they were told. What's clear is that President Trump is unable to issue orders and compel the other members of this coalition to simply do as he so wishes. He has to reframe the narrative, if you will, in ways that can enlist their willing participation in this new purpose, whilst at the same time they seek to modify the reframing in ways that they believe is more suitable to whatever it is that they have as their principal purpose. This process of reframing and rearticulation of the coalition, I think, is pregnant with many dangers. They are dangers that go to whether or not President Trump will be successful in reframing the coalition, notwithstanding how subordinated the Europeans appear to be. The inability for President Trump to get Ukraine to actually do what it would appear he would like them to do is suggestive of this problem. Presidents, in many ways, have a negative power. They can take things away and they can stop doing things. But it's actually a lot harder to mobilize others to do what you wish them to do, because at some point, and this is the paradox of power, as you successfully exercise power, that only happens because others have willingly done what you wanted them to do. So power, in a sense of agency, transfers to the subordinate. And I think we're seeing this dynamic at play right now, which is why this inflection point is actually a very important one. The last point to remember in all of this, I think, is that it really sheds light, then before I even touch on the fact that Russia's got a say in all of this, but put that to one side, it actually sheds light on the fragility of this network or this coalition, because not only does he have challenges in herding the coalition together, each member of the coalition, including himself, is also dealing with a fragmented environment. So President Zelensky has the hardline nationalists on the one hand, and public opinion that is increasingly moving towards a desire for a negotiated settlement. The European Commission has a hardline ideological view about democracy versus autocracy. It has a hardline ideological view about Russia as a threat, and yet it is overseeing an economic and social system that is falling apart. And so it's got pressures on that side as well. And of course, President Trump has opponents in Congress, as well as hardliners in Congress who are pushing him to do things that quite clearly he doesn't want to do. And he's having to fend them off as well. So this is in many ways why I think it's unlikely that somehow, this particular weekend and few days represents, a 21st century version of peace in our times.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I guess maybe because I have been a government official for 33 years, as people know on the channel, I have been observing the summit from that point of view. And, anyone who's worked in government for as long as I have will know that government executives are rarely unified in their viewpoint, and there's all sorts of different viewpoints, different camps. And so someone like Donald Trump will be kind of presiding over these sort of pretty chaotic meetings, probably, where he's getting all sorts of differing advice from differing people and being pushed and pulled by his own impulses in different ways. And I think that probably applies to all of, it applies to Ukraine, applies to Europe, applies to Britain as well. Do you think, there has been some discussion after the Whitehouse meetings about these issues of security guarantees. Did you have some comments on that?
Well, it seems that we've got a few different things that are at play. So after the meeting in Anchorage, the report and the comments from President Trump in particular suggested that President Putin was cognizant of the need to provide security for Ukraine. after the war concludes. I suspect that what that was pointing towards is actually quite different to the kind of discussions around security guarantees that are now taking place in Washington and in Brussels, where in fact, they're very different ideas, totally, I suspect. And we're starting to see how this fragile coalition is in some ways constantly being cobbled together and recobbled together around ideas that never quite gel. So, and this goes to this issue of the extent to which single figures ultimately have authority in these complex multi-actor environments. So President Trump, in a sense, opened a space for this question of post-war Ukrainian security guarantees to be entertained. Needless to say, the Europeans leapt into that space and tried to occupy that space and dominate the discursive framing by talking about what is in effect a NATO presence in Ukraine de facto. Again, the Russians have a view on this, and their view quite clearly has been for years that this is unacceptable. And in fact, it's one of the main reasons that is referred to for why the military operation was initiated in the first place. Donald Trump, on the other hand, waxes and wanes between the idea of not having American commitments to the war, because on the one hand, he has a political base that is hostile to the idea of America committing resources, treasury mainly, to the war, and certainly no American boots on the ground. But on the other hand, he's left open the prospects of supplying arms, so long as someone's paying for them, and somehow in the last 24 hours floating the idea that in fact the American Air Force might somehow provide air cover. So that's happening. The Europeans are looking for ways of getting their own boots on the ground, but they'll never go on the ground without American backstops. They know that that would be a disaster and a risk that they could never contemplate. So they're seeking to inveigle the United States more deeper into the Ukrainian quagmire. Now, both of these propositions actually lend themselves to repeating or to rebuilding the same setup that caused the war in the first place, but without an official NATO imprimatur. So suddenly we have de facto NATO on the ground with talk of Article 5 like security guarantees, a NATO light force presence in Ukraine, and none of that's going to wash. So how this discussion went from 5 days ago wanting to move forward towards a peace settlement instead of there being this two-step process advocated by the Europeans, which was the ceasefire, and then the discussions around a peace settlement, Trump moving straight to the peace settlement idea, to now talking about things that will act as a barrier to moving forward towards a peace settlement. And this again, I think, illustrates the fundamental paradoxes of power and the dilemmas that are evident when we have a war that's being fought by a coalition of forces that was orchestrated from behind by the United States over many decades, and having in effect roped others into that agenda, and now seeking to shift that agenda a little, is finding it very hard to bring others along with them. And yet it needs the others to come along on this journey. Otherwise, American authority evaporates as well. So, this is the dilemma of this inflection moment. It's losing on the battlefield. It's seeking to shift its orientation, but it's finding it very, very hard to bring its coalition partners along with it.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, just did a television interview overnight, our time, where I think he explicitly addressed this issue about security interests, and I've just got the section of the interview here. So he says the patronising disregard for international law for pledges often made, deceitfully and formalised on paper, remains evident in these officials. He's talking particularly about European officials to the Ukrainian crisis, without respect for Russia's security interests, without full recognition of the rights of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. No lasting agreements are possible, and these issues require urgent resolution. So he's broadening, I guess, the concept of what security and security guarantees means. But then he says the Alaska summit demonstrated that the US administration is genuinely committed to a settlement not to rearm Ukraine for war, as occurred after the Minsk agreements. So it's not a Minsk 3.0, but to ensure the crisis never occurs, guaranteeing the lawful rights of all states in this region and the peoples inhabiting them. So I do wonder, with that kind of sort of discussion, whether there was an idea introduced perhaps over the last couple of months within Alaska, particularly maybe endorsed, so to speak, at Alaska, about a broader kind of concept, an alternative way forward for security for all the parties involved. That's not NATO or extension of NATO or submission of one or other party to that sort of NATO arrangement. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, Russia has advanced these ideas for a number of years. An alternative to a security arrangement that's currently, NATO pressing in. And it did that, for instance, most recently in December 2021 with two proposed documents, which unusually were released into the public domain. Normally, these documents are circulated at official level and never see the light of day until they progress to agreement. But Russia released two documents, a draft agreement with NATO and a draft treaty with the United States as a basis of renegotiating a security architecture that would satisfy the Russians, but at the same time quite clearly acknowledging that NATO remains a relevant security agent or partner, if you will, in Europe, and of course having to have a separate agreement with the United States. So this is a very interesting point, is that there's a recognition that there needs to be an agreement with NATO as the European shopfront, so to speak, but that was insufficient as a security guarantee, and that a separate agreement had to be entered into with the Americans. And some of that, of course, related to the placement of missiles, right, which the Americans control. And part of the problem I think we've got now is that we're entering into the last 6 months of some missile treaties that desperately need renewing. And one would hope that between now and the end of the year, that the United States and the Russians will be able to at least extend what's in place to enable those agreements to at least not collapse. So I think that there are some ideas floating around, and they've been around for quite some time. Some of these ideas found their way into the settlement that was initialed in March and April 2022. And you've got to remember, back then, that particular set of settlements left Ukraine territorially intact, except for Crimea. Okay, so bracket Crimea out, that was 2014, and that's in effect gone. Right? There isn't anybody other than hardliners and those who need to maintain the favour of hardliners who accept that somehow that's going to change. But of course, it's a sticking point, because unless, for instance, President Zelensky can maintain the confidence of the hardline nationalists in his own political environment, he runs the risk of losing their political support. So these are all of these tensions that are pulling everybody, which makes it almost impossible for a consistent position to emerge in the collective Western coalition around a future that recognises the realities on the battlefield. Right? So these are the dilemmas that they all face now, which leads me ultimately to conclude that despite all the talk of security guarantees that are buzzing around at the moment, none of that will fly. All of that will reinforce in the minds of the Russians, as you've gone through with Sergei
mm,
Lavrov's comments, that they will just need to press on. There's nothing there that gives them confidence that that anything is going to change substantively, and therefore they have no choice but to press on to a point where he did also in that interview talk about questioning the rationale of Ukrainian sovereignty itself, right,
mm,
at the end.
mm,
And and I think that this was a very subtle point to say, unless people think sensibly and constructively and creatively and realistically now, this will continue to a point where there will be, in effect, no Ukrainian state to speak of.
mm,
And let's not forget that there are some hardliners in Russia who have that view, and they're in the minority at the moment.
mm,
But there are hardliners everywhere you go, and so not only are some of the hardliners pushing for Odessa to be reclaimed and incorporated into the Russian Federation, there are hardliners who literally take the view that that really Ukraine should be reabsorbed
mm.
into the greater Russian sovereign polity. And I think Lavrov was, in a sense, saying, "Look, uh, we can live with a world in which there is an independent Ukraine." In fact, we had that view right through, but be careful what you wish for, and if you dilly dally, drag the
Mm,
chain for too long and can't come to a sensible and realistic view of these issues, the risk is that there will be no Ukraine to speak of at the end, and
mm.
um, that of course is the ultimate tragedy of this process.
Indeed. And indeed, from my perspective, I feel to some degree that scenario is, well, in many ways quite likely, or at least there's a kind of a state failure going on right now in Ukraine. And that is actually a common ground for the, or particularly Europe, Russia, and the United States, because I don't think it's really in any of those parties' interests to have a collapsed, dysfunctional second largest country in Europe, Ukraine. Um, and in some ways, I think it's also part of the problem with some of the advocates, I guess, of Russia just pushing on and winning on the battleground. I think they forget that war is politics continued by other means, and you actually have to think about what the political solution is. And at some point, there's going to have to be a construction of some kind of process to reconstruct some kind of functional Ukrainian state after this war. So, and to me, that's I feel that is part of also the sense of urgency people have with the recent summit, because I think things are getting really quite difficult there.
Well, quite clearly, they're getting very difficult. As I said,
Mm,
I don't think any of these meetings would have happened had
mm,
reality not become brutally um, uh, undeniable.
mm,
And that reality will continue unfolding. I think if you follow, uh, many people who go over
mm,
the battlefield details in incredible detail,
mm,
it's quite clear that
mm,
the collapse is gathering pace, that attrition is actually having its effects, which is ultimately creating permanent weaknesses in the system.
mm,
And they can't be papered over. There are insufficient men, there are insufficient munitions, insufficient machines. And the Western military industrial complex has no way of replenishing that at the same rate that they are being attrited. So
mm,
when that collapses at some point, then you look at topography, right? So after the fortified lines, there's not much left,
mm,
and that will mean that territory then gets gobbled up very, very quickly. So where does this all end up? Well, if it keeps on going, and I think I mentioned in that paper back in
mm,
February or in our
mm,
discussions that uh, the that one possible scenario, and not an unrealistic one, I think, is that this doesn't end until there is a change of regime in Kiev in a way that is satisfactory to Moscow.
mm,
Now, how that happens is a different question, right? But
mm,
and that happens either in a less bloody way or a more bloody way.
mm,
Um, but it's hard to see how Moscow ultimately would accept a Ukrainian polity that didn't have a Russia-friendly regime, doing the business out of Kiev.
mm,
Once and if we actually understand that that is really part of the settlement,
mm,
then it's hard to imagine a world in which the current regime can sustain itself, regardless of the process that's likely to unfold over the next month or 2 months or 3 months.
mm,
Now, I think the real issue then, you talk about the reconstruction, right? I mean, part of the challenge of the legacy of these conflicts, I think, is going to be, particularly in a place where there are some very, very deep feelings about things.
mm,
And I don't just mean the consequences of war per se, but the things that led up to war, right?
mm,
The passionate hardline nationalists um, will likely continue resistance for as long as they possibly can. They will do that in ways that are, commensurate with their capabilities, which will typically involve, terror.
mm,
Um, and so, even if formal hostilities ended at some point, you probably got years of dealing with terrorism to look forward to. Now, and
And indeed, that's already spilling over into Europe now. I mean, there was the incident with the black and red flags in Poland, where people were expelled from the country. There's been issues raised in Czech Republic, Czechia, as well. It's one of the concerns, the sort of Ukrainian dissidents have, is the extreme Nazis have been sort of armed and valorized and uh, given refuge in Europe, and it will be a potentially a very significant problem.
yeah,
So
and the
yeah,
problem won't just be contained to the territory known as
mm,
Ukraine, right?
mm,
Because uh, terrorists, will find refuge where they need to find refuge
mm,
to organize and to conduct the campaigns that they fervently believe in,
mm,
and which means that those who seek to counter these campaigns will, in the end, need or feel compelled to root out these elements, even if they are holed up in other countries.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
so there will be, in a sense, a contagion effect and a
mm,
spillover effect, not just of the refugees who've left Ukraine over the course of the last 3 years, but actually the dissipation of terrorist cells right across Western Europe, who
absolutely,
will then launch their terror campaigns from those bases.
yeah, totally. And I feel part of the game being played between the European states, including Britain and the US at the moment, is it's a bit of a pass the parcel game where they don't want to be end up with the blame with being the person who allegedly has stabbed Ukraine in the back,
Yeah,
which I think is actually one of the cards both Ukraine and Europe actually does have in these sort of negotiations. It has a lot of negative influences, that particular issue, I think, but I think that is absolutely one of the dynamics in the diplomatic positioning of everyone. The European
yeah,
states are going, like the captain going down with the ship kind of thing.
Yeah, so the easiest thing from the US's point of view, so if each of the actors wants to avoid blame,
Mm,
the US has clearly exercised first mover advantage here,
mm,
and is positioned now to pass the baton to the Europeans by saying that if you want to keep fighting this, we'll sell you the arms, but we're not committed to financing this adventure anymore. And the minute they do that, of course, they can wipe their hands off it. And of course, there'll be cries of betrayal and all those things. And the US will, in the first instance, say, no, no, we're still supplying the hardware. But as time goes on, I think we all know that those hardware supplies will trickle. The constraints of the production systems will become apparent. America will have its own priorities away from the European theatre. And as the war continues to fail in Ukraine, the Americans will actually say, look, we gave the Europeans, all the assistance that they asked for, and they've fumbled it. They've made a mess of it, and it's just a bit of bad luck, but they stuffed it up,
mm,
and that's where this can end up. Now, if you think about this from a time frame point of view, Jeff, we are at the first eighth of this presidential term,
mm,
which means there are 3.5 years left of blame avoidance at the
mm,
worst, right?
mm,
Which means dragging this thing out for a long time, so long as Washington doesn't get blamed for it. And it's not just blame in any generic sense. The challenge that, well, and obviously from a personal legacy point of view too, but the challenge for Washington, I think, at this current moment historically, is that any perception or any added perception that it is militarily uh, not as strong as the brochure says they are feeds into the accelerating dynamics of multipolarization, which the US is trying desperately to put the brakes on.
mm,
So so Washington is in a different, has a set of different priorities, right?
mm,
It wants to not only avoid blame because it doesn't want to look bad and responsible, morally culpable, and all those sorts of things, but it's actually got something else at play here, and that is it cannot afford to be seen as ultimately a Potemkin military, right, which is
mm,
all front or all tip and no iceberg.
mm,
And so it will be driven by some slightly different sets of interests to Europe. Europe is not that materially important to Washington, provided that you know it can force at times Europe to do certain things. So as we've been discussing, it's never quite as straightforward as daddy telling the children what to
mm,
do. The children do have a mind of their own, even if that mind is uh, you know heavily subordinated to the wishes of others.
mm, mm. Uh, One of the common issues identified in many people's sort of, I guess, longer term vision for resolving the conflict is, a new security architecture in Europe. The fundamental root cause, people say, is eastward expansion of NATO, and I guess the disregard of Russian security interests as part of the Western Eurasia. Um, it does strike me that that is an extraordinarily complex problem to solve, especially when you view it in a global context. Because if we want to renegotiate the post 1945 security presence of America in Europe, why don't we renegotiate the post 1945 security presence of America in the West Pacific? And if I were a Chinese diplomat, that would be the first thing I'd sort of say in response to that. So it's very complex to solve, and probably it strikes me, given that America is sort of making baby steps into diplomacy. I mean, I don't know if there's been a significant sort of conflict resolution summit held on American soil for a very long time. It does seem to be perhaps too big and complex and long term an issue to be solved, at least with the current team. So I wonder, thinking constructively, how could one potentially break down this sort of big problem of security architecture of Europe into perhaps more manageable pieces that could actually be delivered through, a staged series of agreements, perhaps.
Well, clearly resolving this, the Russia question is central to it.
Mm.
Um, and and that can be resolved with or without NATO. Clearly, there are forces in Europe that are hostile to NATO as well. So there are active campaigns about the need to disband NATO. There is no reason for NATO to exist after the end of the Cold War, etc., etc. Needless to say, of course, countering that is the sort of fear mongering, or the genuinely held fears of Russian expansion. Right. So you've got a very febrile environment now um, to try to resolve uh, deep-seated animosities both ways and total lack of trust. Um, the if you look at the really practical stuff, um, uh, you know, missiles pointed towards your capital. Let's start with that. Addressing the medium-range missile question is necessary. That's an important first step. The second step is to resolve the extent to which the Americans and or NATO continue to agitate in the liminal states that currently continue to sit in the liminal lands in between Western Europe proper and Russia. So that's the second issue that you can practically address, which is that persistent destabilization of the Russian fringes. That needs to come with not just security guarantees in a narrow sense, but perhaps needs to be wrapped up in a broader discussion around what security is all about. Security in some ways, of course, is about minimizing the risk of conflict. But if security isn't also in the name of enabling prosperity, then really, what's the point of it? To be pure and poor doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. It doesn't exercise the human capacity very, very much at all. So, how do we refashion an economic redevelopment program that gives real prospects to the people who live in these liminal areas, whether it's in Georgia, of course, as we've been discussing in Ukraine itself, and then into some of those areas more towards the south. So there's some very practical things that can be done there. There are questions around the location of troops, but I think quite clearly the Russian attitude now is that if NATO and other NATO member troops built up on the border with Russia, then Russia will respond accordingly with its own build up of troops on those borders. Because that sort of counterbalances each other out, I think any settlement can kind of live with that. But it's the ability to locate missiles in places that can then create that sort of the serious unsettlement. So I think that there are obvious things that need to be done. There are other things that can be done that will, in a sense, signal the beginnings of a more constructive relationship, and they're often more symbolic than anything else, but necessary in the language of diplomacy, where a lot of things happen through gestures and small actions that prove commitments to do certain things. Of course, there have been aborted discussions around normalization of relationships in terms of embassies and consulates and things. That's small stuff. There's the question of frozen Russian assets, right? That can actually be dealt with relatively straightforwardly as a constructive gesture. It doesn't undermine anything. It really, $300 billion isn't going to make a jot of difference in the grand scheme of things, but nonetheless, it's an important gesture. Then there are questions around the various sanctions, and there's 26,000 of them, right? So there's a lot, and that actually offers an incredibly rich um, array of materials where trust building can be entertained one small step at a time. In fact, there's 26,000 plus small steps at a time that could be entertained around those sorts of things. So there's a lot that can be done that individually never seems too much, but nonetheless starts to move the capacity for parties to engage with each other along. At the heart of it, though, ultimately must be a resolution of the situation in Ukraine. And whether we like it or not, that resolution is going to be largely on Russian terms. That's the realistic outcome. And I know that there's a lot of people who'll be watching this who will find that proposition disconcerting and uncomfortable for lots of reasons. And that's why I preface it by saying whether we like it or not, without Russia's buy-in to the solution for Ukraine, there will be no solution for Ukraine. And that's just where we're at.
Yeah. Yep. I sometimes wonder too whether maybe, I mean, we tend to talk about NATO and European security as a whole, but whether it could also perhaps be broken up a little bit to talk about reassurances for the sort of East European states, the Visegrad sort of states, kind of the Baltics, plus and Hungary, Slovakia, and potentially Czechia, not in the not too distant future, will all be sort of wanting to have a more constructive security sort of arrangement, probably with Russia. So whether and those states have also been amongst the most ideologically driven within the NATO alliance, and I'd say probably manipulated by people whose security interests are sort of off the coast of Western Europe. So yeah.
Look, one of the challenges is obviously deep-seated historical Russophobia. Right now, that's not going to disappear very quickly, but without calling it what it is, and then thinking about how that affects relations with a geographical neighbor that you can't get rid of, there's always going to be some limits as to what can be done. Part of the problem is actually the way that the United States has viewed Europe as an extension of its own empiric interests. If you looked in West Pacific Asia region, notwithstanding the American presence militarily, that hasn't stopped an incredible amount of economic integration between China, Japan, Republic of Korea, and right through Southeast Asia, ASEAN. The Americans haven't been able to stop China's development, notwithstanding recent efforts to contain it. So economic integration has continued with a full head of steam in Asia, notwithstanding the American presence. The problem in Europe is that the Americans could not countenance the idea that there is deep and economic alignment and collaboration between Russia and Western Europe. And this goes to Russia's role as an energy provider, which was seen to be anathema to American geopolitical and commercial interests in Western Europe, to a point where the pipelines were blowing up. Right. So unless you can get to a point where you can re-establish these economic relationships, which in some ways are your lowest hanging fruit. So trade is actually something that's not too hard to do, even when parties don't get on that well.
Mm.
Right? Funnily enough, trade can persist despite many, many differences. And so trade, in a sense, is the easiest thing to get up and running again. Um, then investment flows become more difficult because of stability issues and paranoias around security implications of having foreign owned firms in different countries. So investment's a long way off, but trade is certainly one. Enabling people to move, I think, is also quite important. Re-establishing cultural connectivity. At the outset of the war in Ukraine, a whole bunch of Russian cultural dimensions were in effect banned, right?
Mm.
And I don't
Mm.
just mean in Ukraine itself, which had
Mm.
its own sensibilities around it, but right across Western Europe and in North America, where the Bolshoi Ballet was banned, where Russian nationals who were performers in artistic troupes basically got run out of these performances, where Russian sports people were denied the ability to play under the Russian flag.
Mm.
Now, all of these things can actually be unwound,
Mm.
because without reconnecting people again, it's actually very, very hard to um, create that more settled environment, an environment that is a little bit less paranoid
Mm.
and less hostile to each other.
Mm.
So, they're the sorts of things that need to, I think, come with a package deal.
Mm.
There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important. I mean, I had Sheila Fitzpatrick, the eminent historian of the Soviet Union and Russia, on the show not so long ago, and one of her comments was, all academic exchanges have been kind of cut off at the moment. So people can't go to to Russia and understand the country. And it's sort of the reverse of what was going on even in some of the darker days of the Cold War. It's really quite an astonishing outcome. So I do think those people-to-people contacts are a genuine constructive thing, but it will require. I mean, we've just seen the media response to the summit, and the hysterical comments about Molotov Ribbentrop packs and all this kind of thing, and it will require some pretty steady and skillful political leadership to, I guess, start to change the tone of the
Yeah,
public conversation.
look, and this is the pivotal question:
Mm.
is the political leadership that's needed?
Mm.
Because uh, I'm sure that there are plenty of organizations and institutions that would more than happily host these sorts of exchanges, whether they are in music or the arts, or in education. Um, but they need the political cover. They need to know that when certain quarters of a society react adversely to them playing this role, that they will be protected and defended at a political level and not hung out to dry. And in fact, that they are de facto implementing these exchanges um, uh, as part of a broader program of rapprochement. Now, these things can be done. I mean, we've seen long-standing conflicts resolved step by step, inch by inch. China was able to facilitate a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That took a best part of 5 years, really, right? So it took a long time, but you can start normalizing the exchange of people, the exchange of ideas, and a reopening up to the prospects of having conversations and dialogue. Then you start getting things happening in the right direction. But again, until I think Ukraine is resolved in a way that acknowledges Russia's security interests, none of this is going to matter.
Yeah.
And the dilemma there, of course, is that what that really means is um, even if the Russians and the rest of the world will not say so, what it really means is a strategic Western defeat.
Mm.
And who wants to fly the white flag?
Mm.
Nobody. Right?
Mm.
This is one of the reasons why I think the Europeans are digging in so hard.
Mm.
Right? Nobody wants to acknowledge the defeat that's unfolding. Interestingly, I think it was about 2 years ago. Actually, it was when President Putin was interviewed by Tucker Carlson,
Mm.
and he was asked about this question of dignity and humiliation and things like that. And Putin was quite clear that he believed that there were ways, but it's really up to the West to imagine how it could settle this in a way that will settle the West's own sense of what dignified defeat means. Because at the end of the day, what is this sense of shame and loss of dignity and humiliation? Well, it's actually the sense that you feel when you're in that position, right? Because that's what you think other people think of you. Other people have their views anyway. Right? But I think the lessons that have been learned by Russian officials, at the very least, if not people in the general populace who are a little bit more emotional, I guess, about these things, is that with victory comes a level of responsibility, and with that also comes the need to be magnanimous. Otherwise, you've just laid the seeds, sowed the seeds for the perpetuation of conflict. Right?
Yeah. Yes, I think I wrote in one of my first written pieces after being unable to publish public servant that the challenge for the BRICS states was to defeat America without humiliating America. And I guess defeat NATO in a way, and I guess that sort of story is sort of being played out at the moment. So, and things like Putin saying, yes, it was Biden's war, even though he surely knows it wasn't just Biden's war. I think are good examples of that. In fact, I looked into this remark that he made at the press conference and what the actual call, what the conversation he was referring to. And it was actually the conversation he had with Joe Biden about 2 weeks before the special military operation began. So it was sort of like, Joe Biden, the readout was basically, this is your last ultimatum, Vladimir. And the readout from the Russian side was totally different. I mean, there was no reference to the Russian point of view in the American readout, but the Russian point of view was raising all the issues about root causes and, NATO and collective security and the potential catastrophic consequences of bringing nuclear states to conflict. So it's an interesting.
This sense of insecurity, you've got to respect people having that sense of insecurity, right? So I think the Russians, having experienced it themselves, are compelled to also acknowledge that others have a sense of insecurity about them. That's the nature of the beast. Their objection has been that no one's taken their senses of insecurity seriously, and ultimately, of course, they've responded to that. Where they literally believe that the survival of their state is at stake, and so they've responded in the only way that they can at this point. But this issue of the security or sense of insecurity that others now feel, and sitting here objectively, you can say that that might not be warranted, right? So you can, and I think quite reasonably, run the argument that says, look, the Russians don't have either the means nor the intent to go beyond what they're trying to accomplish. That's not going to assuage many people in Western Europe that that's the end of the matter. They will continue to hold the view that Russia's on the march. Russia, of course, has held the view that NATO has been on a march for years, and NATO has always said, "Oh no, we're just a defensive alliance. We've got, we're all good, and you've got nothing to be concerned about." pleading that never gets you anywhere, and that's an important lesson to learn here, right? That both
Yeah.
sides will have their own view. And once you actually understand that, you do, I think, realize that you've got to transcend this framing.
Mm.
And that means you must, at some point, start talking about indivisible security.
Mm.
Because without having a serious discussion about indivisible security, where the security of one is not at the expense of the other, but is in fact intimately intertwined with the security of the other, you won't get over the fact that one side always feels insecure about the other side. And maybe that's where this particular conflict is going to drive the parties in Europe ultimately towards. It's not the first time, in 1975, the Helsinki Accord reached a whole range of important conclusions about indivisible security, and they were promptly ignored, principally ignored by the Americans and NATO, I might add. And of course, there was the window of opportunity in the 1990s after the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the dismantling of the Berlin Wall for a different European architecture to be fashioned. One that Gorbachev spoke of. The great European family, so to speak. But none of that happened. And again, we know why. There was no intent on the Western side of that particular decades-long conflict to take their foot off the throat. The opportunity.
I mean, going back to what we were saying before about divided executives, I mean, there were people who were actively advocating
Yeah,
taking but they lost out in
they
the
lost the
internal
battle.
arguments.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and which, I mean, I guess, which is an interesting reflection, maybe, as we draw to the end. I've just been reading or rereading this book here by Christopher Clark. I don't know if you know it, Sleepwalkers,
Yep.
How Europe Went to War in 1914. It's a fascinating, sort of, a kind of, I guess, the current definitive account of, the start of World War One, if you like. But one of the things it really emphasizes is this question of the divided executives of Europe. They were very complicated states with many different voices around foreign policy and very changeable perspectives within that, depending on who's prevailing at one time or the other, and with quite quirky sovereigns. King or Kaiser Wilhelm of the Second of Germany, as I was reading the book, was sort of rather reminding me of Donald Trump. Sort of off the cuff remarks, off remarks, and a person whose moods and perspectives had to be managed by his senior ministers. But he really emphasizes that, it wasn't an inevitable march to war, that there were actually seeds for a better future. In some ways, actually, the fact that it ended up as a war was a quite improbable scenario. So that, even in these, with all the malevolent actors and all the rest of it, there's internal arguments going on within all of these states to perhaps find that pathway towards collective security.
Yeah, and look, I mean, warfare in a funny kind of way is often the result of just chronic failure in statecraft, right?
Mm.
And so the sort of historical lesson to be learned is to try and understand what makes better statecraft compared to failed statecraft, because failed statecraft, the defining characteristic of failed statecraft is war.
Mm.
And to not be able to mitigate against the risk of war. And I guess that this is one of the emerging lessons out of all of this, is that not only has there been failed statecraft, but perhaps the art of statecraft has disappeared
Mm.
for very understandable reasons. When you no longer have a need for it, in the unipolar moment, then those skills are less desirable. And so there's no careers to be built in cultivating deep competencies, institutionalized competencies in statecraft. I was speaking with Ian Proud, the former British diplomat in Moscow, a couple of weeks ago, and we sort of reflected a little bit upon the hollowing out of the public service, particularly in the area of the foreign service, and that hollowing out basically destroyed the capability of that institution to cultivate the persona of the diplomat. Right. So if you look at what a diplomat is, and the things that go towards effective diplomacy, these are skills that can be taught and learned, but they're not taught and learned anymore. Whether they're language skills, whether they're cultural skills, whether they're broader skills around curiosity about the other place. When the life of an embassy staffer is basically hooking up with other people from like-minded embassies, you've really lost the capacity for representation in other countries to build better understanding with other countries. And so this is where we're at. The other thing that I think is a little bit disconcerting all the time, and we see this a lot, there seems to be this sort of, maybe it's media driven too, but this sense that politicians constantly need to remind people that there are differences, right? So, we get the rhetoric of, we'll stand up when we differ. And it's just like, well, of course you will, but we're not really paying you to do that. What we're paying you to do is to advance our cause, and our cause is to have better livelihoods, more secure livelihoods, safer livelihoods, and improve prospects for the flourishing of our families and our communities. I really don't want to hear you spend your time emphasizing why you've got some difference with someone else. I actually want to know what you're going to do about improving the things that I've just articulated. But there's an obsession with reminding the world that we have these differences. Well, great, whoop-de-doo, I say, we've got our differences. But what are you going to do about them? Leadership isn't simply about saying we've got our differences. Leadership is actually about how we manage to get by and then get along, not just notwithstanding our differences, Jeff, but because of our differences, right? How does that actually feature in the frame today? And it doesn't really, right? And that, I think, is in many ways the epitome of the hollowing out of statecraft.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. Well, Warwick, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we sign off, I just wanted to mention two things. One, everyone should share, like, and subscribe, all that sort of stuff. Help promote the video in the algorithm. I do feel YouTube's been a little bit harsh on me in the last couple of weeks. But on this question of sort of statecraft, I actually did an interview last week just before the Alaska summit with a historian, Professor Michael J. Carley, who's just written a kind of a trilogy about the sort of pre-1941 diplomacy, the 1930s diplomacy in Europe, the peace in our time, Munich 1938 moment, but from the, based on research in the Soviet archives as well as Western archives as well. And it is a completely different story, and it's a really tragic story of these constant attempts to form a defensive alliance against, Hitler's Germany, being rebuffed by the Western partners. So people should absolutely check that out, because it's an interesting illustration of the point you were just making, Warwick. But Warwick, you've also been writing at your Substack at warwickpowell.substack.com, and people should also check out my pieces at jeffrich.substack.com. It's there on the screen. And is there anything in particular that you wanted to point out in some of your recent articles that people might want to check out, Warwick? Or
Look, it's a pretty diverse range of things, but within the straitjackets of some core themes. And if you're interested in alternative views of economic dynamics, you might find what I write about thermodynamics and its foundational role in economic systems of some interest. It's my core areas of research is actually in cross-border supply chains, payments and information systems, right? And how they interact within the context of international geopolitical economy. Um, the day-to-day goings on of international relations and geopolitics per se tend to grab the headlines. So I'm often dragged into at least providing a few thoughts on it, but I mainly do that as a way of contextualizing the things that I'm sort of much more deeply engaged in. So a bit of international relations, but not in the usual way. A bit of economics, but in a much more materialist sense, material sense. And I'm doing some work at the moment, which I've been threatening myself to publish soon, but it never seems to complete, which is a body of reflections on cross-civilizational dialogue, where I look at the Western liberal tradition on, basically German Enlightenment, Hegel, Kant, ideas of individualism, and how they uh, how I firstly provincialized them. So I stripped them of their metaphysical aspirations and provincialized them as pragmatic responses to the problems of the time. And that enables then to create a pathway or a bridge with the sort of much more role-driven ethical discourse that we find in say China, and hopefully through that create some ideas around cross-civilizational dialogue around the question of what is it to lead a good life, and what is it to have a good life, and to create good communities.
it's fascinating.
I'll publish that sometime soon.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, I've been promising to do something on the civilization state concept, but I actually did a video the other day that was looking at Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, and reread the book as in preparation. And what I discovered was there's this whole little section in there about where he described Australia as a torn, one of his cleft states that was seeking under Paul Keating and Gareth Evans, who I spoke to on the program, to defect from the West. It's sort of like my respect for Samuel Huntington's political analysis fell catastrophically after reading that. Not that it was all that high anyhow, but it's really actually quite an amusing little passage. So people will see that in a week or so. So
Looking forward to it.
thanks everyone for joining me live. And thank you, Warwick, for the conversation today. It's been fantastic. And I will just end the stream here, and we'll have a sort of slightly edited version of the video up in a day or two. Okay, ciao all.
Thanks again, Jeff.